welcome to the Unknown Warrior podcast with Jason and Pete. Today we're delighted to be joined by Laura Wittman. She's the author of a book called The Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, Modern Mourning and the Reinvention of the Mystical Body, which is available from University of Toronto Press. She's an academic and researcher who's written a lot about the Unknown Warrior and remembrance and commemoration in general. So we thought it'd be brilliant for you to come onto the podcast so we can kind of move away maybe from just looking specifically at the British Unknown Warrior and look at some more international unknown soldiers that were created after the First World War. So thank you very much for joining us on the podcast.
My pleasure. It's great to be here. Thank you.
So how did the huge losses experienced by France in particular impact the ideas for commemoration and remembrance within that country?
Yes, that's a great question. I think one of the big differences would be that in France, there was this problem of massive numbers of dead soldiers that needed to be buried, that were in French soil, that were near civilians, that had to be taken care of. And they were often at the front line, but nonetheless, I mean, you can see the problem. And this was the first war in which governments had promised to give each individual soldier a proper burial, which was new. In the past, governments would, use mass graves, and only important people, generals, leaders, would get their own special graves. So there was this big issue of what to do with all these bodies that were quite visible and very much in the way. And I think that one of the origins of the unknown soldier idea was the impromptu grave that comrades would create, right? They would find a dead body. They would not necessarily even know who that person was, and they would bury that body and put a makeshift cross made of whatever they could find. Sometimes there would be dog tags hanging on it. So we have photographs of these graves from 1916 already.
The creation of the idea for taking one body from the battlefield, one unknown soldier, and bringing them to a central place where people could use that body as a symbol for any of their lost loved ones. It was created in France. The concept of this was created in France around the same time as David Railton was coming up with that idea in Britain, wasn't it? It was working in parallel, really.
Yes, and in Italy as well, actually. All three nations. It was one of the things I was trying to figure out in my book was, can we find a first proposal, a first idea? All three nations, I believe, at various times claimed that they came up with the idea first, but I couldn't find any evidence really in favor of any one of the three. And I concluded that they were working in parallel, as you said, and also that in fact, the people who proposed it officially, so Railton, or in the case of France, a man named Francis Simon, Giulio Douai in Italy, they themselves didn't want to take credit for inventing the idea. They kind of pointed to soldiers and to these impromptu memorials that were already happening. And I think they weren't being falsely modest. I think they were genuinely observing a phenomenon that was happening on the battlefield in no man's land, and maybe crystallizing it, giving it form, and in particular, I think bringing the government's attention to how powerful this form of burial could be if it became sponsored by the government, right? So I think that's what we can credit them with.
As Jason said, we kind of delved into how the UK Unknown Warrior came about. So it's really interesting to see, like as you say, the kind of parallels between that. Yeah, so give us a kind of overview. How did those processes differ and how did they remain the same?
So the Italian one, I think, is the stranger story, in the sense that there was this quite famous writer, Gabriele D'Annunzio, who was also an aviator in World War I. He was a big champion of Italy's intervention in the war in 1915, and became a very vocal sort of encourager and animator of the Italian troops. And part of how he fulfilled this role was by creating new types of commemoration for the dead and emphasizing this sense of extreme camaraderie between the soldiers who were still living and still fighting and their dead comrades. And he took a friend of his who died in 1917, who was called Giovanni Randaccio, a specific foot soldier who died, and created this huge commemoration for him that became, because D'Annunzio was famous, well before World War I, the newspapers would follow his adventures. And so this commemoration that he invented for Giovanni Randaccio was published in a lot of tabloid newspapers. And because he was D'Annunzio, he also was able to write a special oration or speech in honor of Randaccio that was published as a small book. And the book itself was translated into French and Italian and distributed to soldiers all over Italy, France, and the UK. In this book, he describes Randaccio as the prototype for every dead soldier, and specifically says that commemorating his death is a way to commemorate the deaths of all the unknown soldiers who have not received a proper ceremony yet. So even though Randaccio was a specific person and not anonymous, like the unknown soldier, the unknown warrior, there's this idea of one specific body standing in for all the others that have not been recovered, right? And the Italian proponent of the unknown soldier memorial, the sort of government proponent, was also an aviator, Giulio Due, who was an admirer of D'Annunzio and who uses the same language. So you can literally find some of the exact same phrases that he uses to describe how the honors given to this one body will be able to assuage all of the mourning. There's all this language of the mourning mothers and the mourning parents and the mourning children who have no body to connect to, and how this body will replace those, right? So there's this way in which D'Annunzio kind of, I think, as an artist, really sort of feeds the imagination of the unknown soldier. In France, the official proponent was Francis Simon, and I think his proposal actually came in a little bit before Douai's proposal. And the language is also very similar. I mean, obviously in French this time, it's not the connection is not as exactly direct. But in both cases, what you have is military men suggesting to their governments, this would be an extraordinary way to honor the foot soldier. That's the other theme that is really important. The idea of the il fante in Italian or le poilu in France, the importance of giving, there's this contrast that is made in the text, this huge state honors for someone who is extremely small and modest, right? And that's the contrast that they want to emphasize. So I think that's kind of the basic, how it starts. And the other thing that I found remarkable was that both the French government and the Italian government, when you look at the government documents, there are some interesting discussions between the military and parliament, in that parliament and politicians were a little bit worried about emphasizing even more just how many people had died, how many people had died losing their identity without burial. They sort of questioned, is this a good thing to commemorate that so many people didn't get a proper grave? And the military responded really talking about how popular this idea was with soldiers. So even before the government adopted it in France or Italy, it was already popular with military men. And the government, the Italian government in particular, I found they felt very pressured into creating this memorial, whether they liked it or not, basically. It was sort of, okay, we have to do it. Let's try to find a way to make it more acceptable to us, more uniting from our perspective.
It's fascinating, really, to think that we take a lot of our traditions around remembrance and commemorate soldiers lost in conflict for granted, really. In a way, I think that you just assume it's always been there, and that's always been the case. And as you say, really, it's the First World War when these grand statements of remembrance and commemoration, having monuments and stuff, it's the first time that kind of comes about, doesn't it? Is there anything in antiquity or in history that they're kind of trying to draw upon to kind of give them ideas as to how we can commemorate these unknown soldiers?
One reference is clearly ossuaries that were used in the ancient world, and in particular in the Peloponnesian War. And they would often collect all the remains that they would find on the battlefield and create an ossuary, so a tomb for all the remains together, and then list names, but mostly only of famous fighters whose names would be known, right? So it was not an exhaustive list. And you see some of this with World War I, and people have written about how there's this sort of peculiar separation where in small towns all over France and Italy, you have these lists of names, the dead from that town, right? Sometimes very long lists for very small towns. And then the body for all of them is somehow in Paris or in Rome. And this was kind of the innovation, right? It was a way to take those names that are local and somehow connect them to the national, the centralized, right? So making it at once local and central. The other historical background that's interesting is the American Civil War, which people have argued is actually the first time where there was a kind of democratization of soldiers, in part because it was a civil war. And there was a famous soldier, it's a little bit like Giovanni Randaccio. His name was Amos Humiston. And he also was buried with a fair amount of ceremony and was referred to as the unknown soldier who would sort of stand in for, again, all the others who were missing. So it was, that idea already existed in the Civil War. They didn't actually create an unknown soldier memorial. They had ossuaries, so with many remains mixed together. But the concept was already sort of beginning to be talked about.
And we've covered a lot within our research into the story of the British unknown warrior about kind of the selection process and the fact that for the British it was all about secrecy. It was about secrecy and keeping the identity secret, so there was no way anybody could find out who they were or from what battlefield that they came from, whatever, so that completely unknown, unique nature would stay sacred and would stay that way, so that its power would never be lost to connect with people. And obviously that complete secrecy has led to different stories coming out and different people claiming to be involved and sort of some quite left field different things that we've kind of looked into. What was the selection process like in France and Italy? Did they follow the same kind of path of secrecy, or did they look at it from a different angle?
So they both also had this idea that secrecy would be important. And in France, they had 8 battlefields where they did exhumations. In Italy, there were 11. But in both cases, the exhumations were done by the military and the public was very deliberately kept away from them. And then in both cases, there was a ceremony, and I believe it was the same thing in the UK. There was a ceremony where one among the bodies that came from these battlefields was chosen to be the unknown soldier in various ways that were intended to emphasize randomness, right? That there would be no choosing of a particular battlefield or a particular body. So in the French case, they originally had a blind veteran in mind. So the blindness being, added guarantee that no choice would be made. And then at the last minute, they had to replace him with someone who actually did have eyesight. But the thrust of it is there, right? The idea of anonymity. And the ceremony itself was actually also not a very major ceremony. I mean, it was visible to the public, but it was very small. It was done at Verdun. And then the chosen body was transported to Paris and to the Pantheon and then the Arc de Triomphe. So the move to Paris was really when this casket and this body became public. And in Italy, there's another twist to the story. There's a few other interesting twists. The person who chose one among the 11 caskets was actually a widow who had also lost her son, which is an interesting choice because in Italy, all of these ceremonies had a much more Catholic component, and she was clearly intended to be a kind of Virgin Mary figure, hence the choice of a woman as opposed to a soldier, which we see in other cases. And she performed, I think, even beyond expectations by fainting on top of one of the caskets and eventually recovering. And, it was very, very dramatic. It was a show. And they did it. It was done not at a military spot as it was in France at Verdun. In Italy, they did it in a cathedral at Aquileia. So again, it was kind of a religious drama with a much bigger audience. And then the transportation of the soldier from Aquileia to Rome was also a public transportation. The casket was put on a train and it proceeded very slowly from northern Italy, where the battlefields were, to Rome, which is important because Italy had recently been unified as a nation, and some would say not very solidly unified, and this transportation across a big part of the country was seen as a way to unite Italians, right? That people all along the way from different parts of Italy would come and kneel and honor the unknown soldier's body as it came by. One last thing I'll mention that's very interesting is governments did want to keep exhumations out of the public eye. I don't know if you've talked about that already, but it was kind of a grisly affair of digging up body parts. And one of the things that I learned was that they were very concerned, of course, about trying to find bodies that would be identifiable as specifically French or specifically Italian. So there needed to be enough remains of uniform or something else. But, if you had dog tags, then the person was no longer anonymous. So that's no good. So there was that problem. And then they were also trying, although there's, conflicting accounts here, they were trying to find a body that would be whole, that would at least have all the required limbs and parts, even if scattered, right? And some of the people who worked on it, expressed doubts about that. How certain are we that the unknown soldier is all the body parts of one person? How certain are we that he's truly French? We don't know exactly. In Italy, interestingly, the military, the man in charge of the exhumations published a book of photographs of what he was digging up. The book was subsidized by a veteran association and published almost, I think, exclusively for the people who participated in the exhumations. This was not a thing you could go to a store and buy. It was the kind of book that people paid for by subscription. But it's an incredible historical document. I've talked to quite a few historians who have told me that they've never seen anything similar in the French case or British or anywhere else, really, that people would document and publish the photographs of something like that.
Yeah, because on the previous episode, we spoke to Peter Francis from the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and he gave us an excellent kind of précis of, just the trauma of being involved in that exhumation process, of what those people had to recognise and see and dig up. And as you say, kind of in the selection process of the unknown soldier and unknown warrior, and just in a wider exhumation case as well. And then so you mentioned then about the kind of how these symbols were kind of, how the unknown soldiers were kind of meant to help bring these kind of countries together, Italy in its state of flux as it was, even more so. Like, so how did what was the kind of public reaction, and kind of what were the governments kind of hoping to kind of get from the combination of the kind of creation of the unknown soldiers?
I think that the governments and the common people had slightly different agendas, as can happen. You can think of the trajectory as expressing an agenda. In France, the unknown soldier was brought to the Pantheon, where in a deliberately secular context, if you want, the intellectual and political ancestors of the French Republic are buried, right? Before he was actually finally buried under the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, he was included in this pantheon, and I think put on the side of the secular republic, very, very specifically, right? And I think for some French people that was great, and for others not as great. And yet the memorial itself, the idea, he remained very popular as a character. And that's where one of the interesting things that I found when I did research on this is that popularity was manifested in a lot of works of fiction and poetry that give voice to this anonymous man, and imagine him to have a personality and a life and a family and to want something for the future of France in this case. So these works of fiction, often imaginary autobiographies, appropriate this character to have him speak what people feel needs to happen after the war. And so in France, there was a definite vein of irony. You won't be surprised to learn about, we don't truly believe that all this fighting was worth it, but now, let's move on in all these other ways. In the Italian case, so let me step back again to the trajectory. It's a more religious trajectory that goes through not only the Cathedral of Aquileia, where he was chosen, but then when he arrived in Rome, before going to the Vittoriano, he also went to the Church of Santa Maria degli Angeli, where he received Catholic absolution, which caused a certain amount of complications too, because how can you absolve someone who doesn't have an identity? But they squared that out somehow. And then he was buried in the Vittoriano, which is the monument at the center of Rome that was built to honor King Victor Emmanuel II, the king who presided over the unification of Italy. So clearly there was unification of church and state that was being expressed here by the government, as well as the church noted rather wryly, the most important place is the place of the king and the state. The church is important, but the final resting place is the state. So there was a little debate and squabbling about that. But as was the case in France, it's in works of fiction and in newspapers that you would see people imagine the unknown soldier speaking and voicing, let's say, less state-sanctioned reasons why he should be listened to. And in Italy, this was particularly, one thing that was particularly salient was a lot of people felt that the Italian government had made a lot of promises regarding redistribution of land, reparations for damages done during the war. So basically all kinds of economic support that had been promised to soldiers and or the families of dead soldiers that didn't really materialize after the war. And the unknown soldier often became the person to voice that complaint, right? To sort of say, why is my family still starving and have no land to cultivate when I fought and I did this and that and the other? So that was a big part of his popularity, was being able to voice all of these complaints. I also would say that the unknown soldier as a literary character and a character in the popular press was often associated with the ones that were known as those who were not chosen. So not the one who ended up in the Arc de Triomphe or in the Vittoriano, but the ones who were sort of left behind, who somehow became, because they didn't receive the major state honor, the identification with the average person was even greater, and they were considered to be more modest and not as appropriated by the government. And so people would often imagine them standing in for, all kinds of views about what should happen after the war. I mean, often pacifist views critical of the war itself. In France, there's an small but interesting pacifist feminist group that tries to adopt the unknown soldier as their son. So you can see how he kind of becomes this character who, gets bigger and different from the monument itself.
It's fascinating to think that, the state's trying to create this monument, but then, giving it back to the people, but then the people take him on board themselves and use him to articulate their own thoughts and issues and feelings and stuff, which perhaps the government didn't realise when they created him, which is a phenomenal thing there, how it's entering that public consciousness and entering the national story. So can we say that it did play a role in helping heal some of those deep wounds felt by families across those countries? Italy suffered horrendous loss, but especially in France, where there was huge losses there, especially at battles like Verdun. Did it help to heal the nation there?
I think it did. I think one really genuinely innovative and powerful thing about the unknown soldier, the tombs of the unknown soldiers all over the world, I think, is that there is a real body there. So it's not an empty tomb. It's not an ossuary. And so it makes real, I think, for the mourner. It helps you feel like you've touched the body, or you've seen the body, you've been close to the dead body of your loved one, right? And there is a fair amount, I think, of psychological research suggesting that this really matters. It helps with closure, that people who never have this connection to the dead body, for example, people who lose partners out at sea and there's never a body to mourn, there's a even greater difficulty in mourning that can happen. And so I think the memorial really helped with that. And there is, I think, a fair amount of testimony showing, I think, especially early on. So I would say, before World War II, that people really, whatever the state said, they still identified in this kind of visceral way with this embodied suffering, and it helped them in some way in their process of mourning. I think after World War II, it kind of changes. Things get very politicized. I mean, in Italy, they get politicized under fascism already. So I think the popular use of the memorial probably got reduced and moved to other places, right? But for a while, I think it was very powerful and very helpful.
And obviously, like you say, with the context of the Second World War and bringing it up to the present day, what role does the Unknown Soldier play in national commemoration in France and Italy today?
So the Unknown Soldiers, both of them still play, a big role in Veterans Day, right? The sort of commemoration, November 11th, the remembrance of all wars. I think that there's a bit of a struggle now that Europe in general, I think, has become, much more overtly pacifist. I mean, not completely, not 100%, but, much more than it used to be. The rhetoric has shifted to, we honor those who fought valiantly, but it's less belligerent, right? It has grown a lot less belligerent over time. But there's, I think, still this idea that we honor those who defended our values, I suppose. It becomes a bit about values rather than about territory, is what I would observe. That said, I think there's a big difference between France and Italy because Italy has had Berlusconi, who styled himself in some ways after Mussolini and was happy to sort of reawaken some of the more bellicist, more violent sounding kinds of commemorations. Mussolini used the Unknown Soldier Memorial to talk about how the Unknown Soldier would always be ready to fight further for the next war, for Italy. And Berlusconi basically said the same and used, had himself photographed in front of the same pose. I mean, you can kind of see it happening. And I think as a result, Italians who were protesting Berlusconi and were protesting the US war in Iraq in 2003 also protested in front of the Italian Tomb of the Unknown Soldier because they were sort of responding to this appropriation by Berlusconi. And all of that didn't really happen in France, I think in part because no Berlusconi. And, in part, I think it's also a visual thing. The tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Paris is completely flat on the ground, and it is completely overshadowed by the Arc de Triomphe, this ancient triumphal arch. Whereas in Italy, the tomb is raised up and very visible and becomes this kind of very emblematic representation of whatever it is you're trying to, it's something to fight over that is right there and on camera, which didn't matter quite as much in 1920, but in 2003, it mattered a lot for your photo op, for your, what you were doing.
And it's fascinating there that it remains relevant, right up until 2003 in future conflicts. And, its symbolism and relevance is still there throughout all of that, even though it was, laid to rest back in 1920.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you mentioned at some point in your podcast that Canada got an Unknown Soldier. I'm trying to remember. I think it was in 2004. So they decided they wanted one as well, and sort of arranged to have a body found and to have a monument created. So it's interesting. It does remain very popular.
Yes, I mean we spoke to again Peter Francis again from the Commonwealth War Graves Commission about the creation of the Australian, Canadian and New Zealand unknown soldiers, as it were, because and that was what was quite nice about bringing it up to date, because they had a selection process again where they had to choose one of the bodies, and it sort of led back to what we were learning about the selection process back in 1920, to make sure that it was a truly unknown body and that it couldn't be identified, so that it could contain this mythical unknown status. So yeah, definitely bringing it right up to date, which shows that it is still relevant today, which shows its importance. That was an absolutely fascinating conversation there, Laura, and it's definitely given our listeners some more context as to what was going on in Europe as well with the creation of the Unknown Soldier there. So I'd recommend anybody have a look at your book, which obviously you explore this in further detail than we've got time, unfortunately, on the podcast. But thank you very much for joining us today, and yeah, thanks very much for exploring this subject.
Thank you very much.